During World War II and the Holocaust in the early 1900s, Jews were considered by the Germans to be dangerous and were sent to concentration and death camps for their extermination. One of these camps was Auschwitz. When the camp was built, they brought not only adults but children too, who would eventually be experimented on by Dr. Joseph Mengele. When the camp was liberated by the Soviets in 1945, only few survivors of the experiments remained. Though the tragedy caused hundreds to die and suffer of mental illnesses and physical damages, it created a triumph in the medical industry, making modern medicine safer. Auschwitz was built in 1940 to serve as a concentration and death camp for Jews during the Holocaust. The camp was often overcrowded with prisoners and had poor sanitization methods. The Nazis had to keep building more subcamps that were connected to Auschwitz, such as Birkenau. The camp was shut down in 1945 by the Soviet troops, but by then the documents and records of Joseph Mengele's experiments had been destroyed. When a new batch of prisoners arrived in cattle cars, the prisoners were directed to the right or left. If prisoners were seen unfit for hard labor, they were sent to the left towards the gas chambers and crematoriums. If you were sent to the right, you were either put into hard labor work or put under Joseph Mengele's special care. This so-called special treatment meant more food and better housing, but it also meant experimentation. Joseph Mengele made sure that any twins, dwarfs, or giants were sent directly to him. He loved the twins the most because to him it meant a completely identical set of specimens. He conducted all sorts of experiments on them. Most meant immediate or slow and painful death. Some experiments were done to find a way to increase the chance of being born into the master race as an Aryan. He somehow got the children to recognize him as Uncle Mengele by being gentle and kind. However, he was a master of hypocrisy and was caring to the children, but as soon as they entered his operating room, he turned into the Angel of Death, his famous nickname. The children under Mengele's care were treated fairly well in their barracks. It wasn't as crowded as where the other prisoners lived and had more access to bathrooms. Mengele would visit them almost every day to bring them sweets and sometimes extra food, but living as a twin in Auschwitz wasn't worth the price. Every morning, no matter the weather, they had to stand outside for hours during roll call. Then, when they went back into their housing and were called for by a Nazi officer to be led to another blood drawing or experiment, they suffered from roll call again every night, repeating the process day after day. Many of the experiments that Joseph Mengele performed in Auschwitz were conducted in the afternoon after roll call. He would perform most of the experiments himself with the help of his associates, some being prisoner doctors forced into helping. Mengele would conduct his research with the experiments including the twins' measurements, blood, mysterious injections, surgeries, and many dissections of the twins' dead bodies. The measurements typically took place in a large room where the twins would stand in rows, naked, and have each body part meticulously measured for nearly 8 hours. These measurements were used later in the other experiments. Experiments with their blood often meant a lot of blood frequently drawn for studying or a blood transfusion between the two twins. When Mengele drew blood from a set of twins, he would draw out liters at a time. He would do this almost 3 times a day, and the twins often fainted, only to be woken up by a slap across the face. Most of the blood transfusions were poorly done and ended up killing both twins. The twins were also injected with some deadly disease or infection. Then, if they had perished from it, the other twin would be killed for the dissection and comparison of the bodies. The identity of the diseases was only known to the doctors, and sometimes they would inject multiple viruses at a time. Dr. Mengele would also perform surgeries upon his imprisoned children. He would remove their organs to see how their body functioned without the specific organ, or make an organ dysfunction and see how the body would react. Mengele would amputate the same limb off both twins, then switch them and sew them back on. And he even sewed 2 young girl twins together in an attempt to create Siamese twins. The experiment failed and both girls died. All of these experiments were performed without the use of anesthesia. The children who survived these experiments until their liberation in 1945 had a long life to live with the burden of the terrible memories the camp held. When World War II ended, only few who undertook the Auschwitz experiments had survived to live past their childhood. Over 1 million children, 3,000 being twins, were pulled from the ramp at Auschwitz. Of that, only 200 of the children experimented on survived to tell their story. Mengele fled to Western Germany, but soon was forced to hide in South America, as he was wanted for unfathomable crimes. He went by the code name Andreas and lived successfully hidden until his death in 1979, when he drowned of a stroke whilst swimming. Eva Moses Kor and her sister Miriam are two of the twins who survived the Auschwitz experiments. Miriam married and had children, but during one of her births, her kidneys failed. Eva said, "I had two kidneys and one sister. It was an easy choice." Sadly, Miriam died a few years later, but Eva still lives on to share her experiences during the Holocaust. Because of the experiments from SS doctors, survivors were scarred physically and mentally. For women, the menstrual cycle could last up to a year at maximum and 4 months or less minimum. For this, females are unable to have kids of their own. Some men and women dealt with eating disorders, such as anorexia, because during the Holocaust, prisoners were served little to no amounts of food. Mental scars include depression and anxiety. Depression caused by being experimented on and the trauma of everything. Anxiety caused by still living in Europe, fearing and worrying that non-Jews were going to abolish them without the help of concentration camps.
After the Holocaust, because of inhumane experiments, the Nuremberg Code was created in hopes to make a safer medical world. This code states that experiments should be conducted under the approval of the subject and should avoid all damage to the said subject.
Number 1. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential.
Number 2. The experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unprocurable by other methods or means of study, and not random and unnecessary in nature. Number 3. The experiment should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of the natural history of the disease or other problem under study that the anticipated results will justify the performance of the experiment.
Number 4. The experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. Number 5. No experiment should be conducted where there is a prior reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except perhaps in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects.
Number 6. The degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment.
Number 7. Proper preparations should be made and adequate facilities provided to protect the experimental subject against even remote possibilities of injury, disability, or death.
Number 8. The experiment should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. The highest degree of skill and care should be required through all stages of the experiment of those who conduct or engage in the experiment.
Number 9. During the course of the experiment, the human subject should be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end if he has reached the physical or mental state where continuation of the experiment seems to him to be impossible.
Number 10. During the course of the experiment, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage, if he has probable cause to believe, in the exercise of good faith, superior skill, and careful judgment, required of him that a continuation of the experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, or death to the experimental subject.